Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, Richard, for that very kind welcome. And I've clearly missed a trick because I'm starting not with one of my own books, which is clearly an error. But I wanted to begin with a brief glimpse of this book because it seems to be exactly the kind of historical digest that we've all been waiting for. History's greatest hits, and I don't know if you can see here down at the bottom, further explanation, famous events we should all know more about. It's a rather stern subtitle, I thought, and its premise is probably unarguable. There are certainly plenty of famous events that I should know a great deal more about. But the particular reason I wanted to start with it today is that it raises the question of what exactly history's greatest hits are and how they might be chosen. Let's take a look at what the contents page offers us from 500 years of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. It's a select bunch, starting at the top here with 1066, the Battle of Hastings, moving swiftly through the Crusades and past Magna Carta in 1215, before encountering the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century. And then here, right in the middle, comes 1415 and the Battle of Agincourt. Now, if we look closely at this small selection, it's one of only two battles that make it into this medieval hit parade. First of all, we have Hastings, the last successful invasion of England, a battle that changed the course of this country's history forever. The second battle in this list, the Battle of Agincourt, didn't. So why is it there? Well, the answer, in one word, I think, is Shakespeare. In the English-speaking world, and by the way, we know we're in the English-speaking world because if you look one further on from Agincourt, you find 1431, the execution of Joan of Arc, not 1429, the victories of Joan of Arc, which surely it would be if this were a French list. But in the English-speaking world, Shakespeare's play, Henry V of 1599, has fixed this battle in our collective imagination. It's inserted it into our cultural DNA. And that's not just because of Shakespeare's genius with words, although there's plenty of that on display in Henry V, as the play moves from "Oh, for a muse of fire," via "Once more into the breach, dear friends," all the way to "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." It's packed with gorgeous lines. But it's also a play with an almost mythical narrative arc. A young man, a young king, newly come to his throne, is determined, after a misspent youth, to live up to the weight of dignity and responsibility that he's now inherited. He has an ancient enemy who doesn't take him seriously. You may remember at the very beginning of the play, the French send a gift, they say, to suit his temperament. "Tennis balls, my liege," says his uncle, a line that somehow in my theatrical memory always pairs itself with Lady Bracknell's "a handbag." But this is a young king who has charisma, integrity, moral purpose, and a vision of his country's destiny. He launches a great invasion of the kingdom across the sea that he claims as his. He takes the port of Harfleur and marches on only to be confronted by the might of the French army. This army is made up of huge numbers, and it's led by the princes of the blood who, with supreme disdain and condescension, assume that victory is rightfully, naturally theirs, even before a blow is struck. You may remember there's another wonderful scene the night before the battle, which opens with the Constable of France declaring languidly, "I have the best armour in the world." But back in the English ranks on the eve of battle, Henry confronts a long, dark night of the soul, and he comforts his men with a little touch of Harry in the night. And then the next day, when battle is joined, it turns out that this is the tale of David and Goliath. The proud and arrogant French are brought down against all the odds by the courage and heart, the resilience and the endurance of the English army. And then, after this astonishing triumph, this moment of catharsis, Henry gets his reward, the hand of a French princess, sweetly wooed across the divide of language, and he's recognised as the heir to the French throne. But of course, glorious as it is, this is a drama. And what I want to do today is to take a closer look at what we think we know about Agincourt, to consider whether the way we think about the battle is an accurate reflection of 15th century reality, and to ask, Shakespeare aside, does it really deserve its place among history's greatest hits? Now, I ought to make clear, first of all, that I'm not, in a specialist sense, a military historian. But of course, it's impossible to write about any period of human history without writing at some stage, many stages, about war. And in tackling the subject of my most recent book, Joan of Arc, the most famous female soldier ever, not only was war inescapable as the defining context of her life and her brutal death, but when I sat down to write, it turned out that it was Agincourt that presented itself as my starting point. And in taking Agincourt as my starting point, my focus wasn't principally on troop movements and topography, on battle plans and tactics, not just because of my own lack of expertise, but also because in dealing with the Middle Ages, those neat diagrams with rectangular blocks moving across battlefields under the leadership of large black arrows can be significantly misleading, because this is a context where it can be tricky to establish even how many soldiers fought on each side to the nearest couple of thousand, let alone where they stood and exactly what they did. Instead, what fascinates me is the psychology and the politics of war. So what I'm going to start with in talking about Agincourt today isn't the battlefield, it's the naming of things. The labels that we attach to the past shape the way that we think about history, and they do it so profoundly that we need to keep a close eye on what that process does to our understanding. Let's think for a moment even about the name of this battle. We call it Agincourt, but there's no such place on the French map. Over there, it's Azincourt. And a large part of what I want to talk about today is the French experience of the dreadful defeat of Azincourt, rather than the victory of the happy few at Agincourt. Straight away, it's clear that we might be dealing with two different stories, depending on where we stand to view the fighting. But Agincourt, or Azincourt, either way, forms part of a grander narrative, and one that also deserves our attention for a moment. That's the narrative of the 100 Years' War. If we want to understand the past, we have to understand how our protagonists saw themselves and the world in which they lived. We need to understand the choices they faced as seen through their eyes, knowing only what they knew when they made them. Because once hindsight comes into play, we're no longer understanding the past in its own terms. And the 100 Years' War is a good example of why that matters. It only takes a moment, once we stop ourselves to think, to realise that those who fought in it had no idea that it was the 100 Years' War they were fighting. For them, it wasn't over till it was over, and they didn't know when that would turn out to be. In fact, the 100 Years' War is a term first coined in the 19th century, like so many of the other neat and evocative formulations that we use about our medieval past, the Wars of the Roses being another. Although in this case, unlike the Wars of the Roses, the 100 Years' War is a term that was first coined in French, la guerre de Cent Ans. And the first usage recorded in the Oxford English Dictionary is from 1874, J.R. Green, in his short history of the English people. In 1453, he declares, the 100 Years' War ended. And what Green and the others who first used the term were suggesting was that the many phases of conflict between England and France that took place between 1337 and 1453, so a period of 116 years rather than around 100, that this conflict as a whole had a unifying principle, a connecting cause. And further, they were suggesting that that cause was the English claim to the French throne first made by Edward III, here he is looking rather splendid on his tomb, in right of his French mother Isabella, the daughter of Philip IV of France. Now this English claim to the French throne was one that Edward and the English kings who succeeded him tried to make good by military means until the moment in 1453 when all English lands in France were finally lost, bar the fortified town of Calais, which lasted one more century until the French recaptured it in 1558. at which point, famously, or so legend has it, a few months later, Mary Tudor died, she said, with Calais engraved on her heart. So if we put it like that, it's entirely possible to see the case for treating this century of conflict as a whole, or at least having some kind of continuity at its core. But if we look a little more closely, the picture gets more complicated. England had held territory in France ever since the conquest of 1066. English kings held the conqueror's Duchy of Normandy until it was lost by bad King John in 1204. But by then, the English also held the Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France, which had been brought to the crown by John's mother Eleanor of Aquitaine when she married Henry II in the middle of the 12th century. And the extent of this English territory in France and the terms by which kings of England held it from the kings of France gave rise to war between the two kingdoms for significant stretches of the 2 centuries before 1337. So by 1337, war between England and France over rival territorial and tenurial claims already had deep roots and a long history. It's true that an English claim to the French throne hadn't been part of that previous conflict, but it's debatable whether the assertion of that claim was in fact a radical reformulation of the conflict between the two sides, or whether it was more just another string to the English king's bow. Edward III, whose claim it was, gave it up in 1360, only a quarter of the way through the 100 years of the 100 Years' War, as part of the terms of a treaty that I'll tell you more about in a moment. It was then revived by his successors, but 1453 didn't mark the end of the claim. Henry VIII, for one, was certainly serious about prosecuting it when he took an army to France in the early 16th century, and it wasn't finally given up and dropped from the English royal title until 1801. Now, all of that suggests that we might need to take a closer look at the shape of events between 1337 and 1453 if we're going to get the hang of what was actually happening in France in the early decades of the 15th century, and specifically in 1415. It's important to recognise that warfare wasn't constant between 1337 and 1453, either in form or in the very fact of there being fighting at all. Edward III, for example, won great successes at sea at Sluis in 1340. If there are any Dutch speakers here, apologies for my pronunciation. He won at Crécy, famously, in 1346, and at Poitiers in 1356, when the French king himself was captured. But in 1360, as I've said, Edward gave up his claim to the French throne as part of the Treaty of Bretigny, in return for holding the territories of Aquitaine, Poitou, Ponthieu, Guines, and Calais, not as a vassal of the French crown any longer, but now in full sovereignty. Then there was peace for 9 years, then war resumed because of French determination to overthrow the terms of the treaty. For 20 years, from 1369 until 1389. Then a temporary truce was agreed, followed 7 years later by an agreement for a further truce, which was intended to last 28 years. So here, in the last decade of the 14th century, was a period of peace between England and France in which the whole ostensible project of the war, the English claim to the French throne, was, if not yet settled, at least in abeyance. And here, therefore, is where we need to look more closely at exactly how events unfolded on both sides of the Channel. How and why did the armies of England and France come to face each other on the field at Azincourt on the 25th of October, 1415? The answer is that both kingdoms were plunged into periods of devastating turmoil, but with very different results. In England, peace with France had been pursued by Edward's grandson, Richard II. Richard was the son of the Black Prince, but it turned out that he had none of his father's military ambition or talents. Instead, Richard saw a much greater enemy facing his sovereignty, the greatest lords of his own realm, who he believed were threatening what should have been his own supreme power in his kingdom. His great lords, on the other hand, thought they were exercising their customary right and duty to advise their king on the welfare and security of the realm. And it was a symptom of how wide the breach between them came and how rapidly that in 1386, during a financial crisis in Parliament, Richard declared that if his subjects continued to rebel against him, he would seek the advice and the help of his kinsman, the King of France, against them. Now, that turned out not to be the most tactful thing to say when the cause of the whole financial crisis was the fact that a French fleet was currently massing in the Channel in preparation for a planned invasion. These repeated crises came to a head in 1399, by which time the 28-year truce with France had been sealed, and Richard was married to a 9-year-old French princess. But in 1399, Richard tried to disinherit his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, without any legal justification. The country would no longer support him in this tyranny, and Bolingbroke deposed the king and took his place as King Henry IV. But usurpation brings its own problems, and during a torrid 14-year reign, facing rebellion, financial crisis, and chronic illness, Henry made no move to reactivate the English claim to France. That was to change in 1413 with the accession of his son, Henry V. Now, by this stage in his life, we shouldn't be thinking of Henry as one of the lads. Whatever mischief Prince Howard got up to, Henry V as king was a ruthless and formidably able ruler with an unyielding sense of his God-given purpose. And we might want to relate this sense of mission to one of his earliest military experiences. His first command at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403 at the age of just 16, when he took an arrow full in the face. And although the shaft was pulled out easily, the arrowhead was deeply embedded 6 inches in to one side of his nose. And the wound had to be kept open for 6 weeks, while the surgeon who was treating him designed and made a special implement to remove it. Now, somehow, without anaesthetic, without antibiotic, Henry survived, although we might note that this famous portrait of him, which survives in this later copy, shows him in profile, perhaps to disguise the scar that he must have carried for the rest of his life. And along with the scar, he also carried a sense of his own invincibility, the certainty that God had not only saved but chosen him for a special destiny. And that destiny was to renew the claim to France bequeathed to him by his royal ancestor, Edward III. And so, after 2 years of putting his house in order at home, in what is a terrifyingly impressive fashion, I did my PhD many moons ago on the Duchy of Lancaster, the private estate of the Lancastrian kings. And as you're reading through the accounts and you come to 1415 and Henry V's succession, you can suddenly feel the cold wind whistling past the ears of the administrators as they realise that under this new regime, not one single penny will escape the new king's notice. It's a formidable campaign during those first 2 years of the reign to restore order to the country and to the royal finances. But that turned out merely to be a prelude to the launching of a great expedition to France in August 1415. By that stage, Henry had gathered an army of something like 12,000 soldiers, perhaps twice that number of horses, as well as support staff and supplies, in a fleet of 1,500 ships. Now, Henry knew his history, and though he was emulating Edward III in his claim to France, his tactics were different. 14th century English armies had combined what was called the chevauchée, devastating raids across huge swathes of French territory, with the taking of particular fortresses, which were then to be garrisoned and held as islands of strategic power. But Henry didn't want to do that. The idea of all of that being really to force the French into compromise, into negotiation. What Henry wanted to do was to take territory, to make good his claim by a systematic, relentless, and disciplined advance into Normandy, across land that could then be ruled and crucially taxed to support further advances deep into the heart of France itself. He would start with the port of Harfleur, a bridgehead that would hold the key to the invasion of Normandy in a way that the existing English possession of Calais, much further north, never could. Now, Henry succeeded in capturing Harfleur, but it took much longer and cost him far more than he'd anticipated. Dysentery took hold among his men during the long weeks of the siege, And by the time the port fell in late September, the force of fighting men that he still had left to him was down to under 10,000. And out of that 10,000, he had to leave 1,200 to garrison Harfleur, whose defences had been severely compromised by the English attack. But he didn't want to scurry back home straight across the Channel. That would hardly be the glorious statement of his rights and intentions that he'd planned. But on the other hand, he couldn't afford to do much more before winter set in. He needed to regroup and to return to England to prepare for a campaign of siege conquest proper. So the plan he settled on was this: a march from Harfleur to Calais to demonstrate his freedom of movement and his power in this French kingdom that he claimed as his, with the additional benefit that it would draw the French military response away from Harfleur, whose walls had in places been reduced to rubble by English guns, and therefore would be difficult to hold by its new English garrison against a concerted French attack. So this march served a double purpose. But on this march, Henry and his much reduced army encountered an obstacle in the form of the River Somme. The threat of massing French forces meant that he wasn't able to cross the river where he'd hoped at Blanchetaque, and that in turn committed him to what turned into a total of 18 days of forced march before his tired and hungry men, an army of somewhere under 8,000 soldiers, with archers, longbowmen outnumbering the men-at-arms by something like 5 to 1, before this tired and hungry force finally encountered the enemy at Azincourt. Now, so far, this narrative is not so unfamiliar or so inconsistent with the unfolding of Shakespeare's drama. But what we need to consider is not just the size of the French army that confronted Henry's Englishmen, it's also the political context that produced it. The French had been through their own years of turmoil in the decades since England and France had last met on a battlefield. Their king, Charles the Well-Beloved, had by this stage acquired a new epithet. By now, he was also known as Charles the Mad. Back in 1392, at the age of just 23, he'd suffered a sudden fit of psychotic violence, in which he'd attacked and killed 5 of his own attendants before he could be overpowered and disarmed. And this turned out to be the beginning of a chronic mental illness, with episodes of psychosis in which he believed that his wife and children were strangers, that he wasn't called Charles, that he wasn't king, even that he was made of glass and might shatter into 1,000 pieces if he were touched. The king's incapacity was so devastating that it precipitated France into a period of intense political crisis. His closest relatives, the great lords of France, began to compete among themselves for control of his government and the profits that came with it. And that was a competition that, as the years went on, simply couldn't be resolved. Every time the king came back to his senses, one set of decisions would be made, and as soon as he lost them again, those decisions would be undone and countermanded. And all the time, the tensions and the rivalries among the most powerful men in the kingdom grew worse and worse, until in 1407, the king's brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, was attacked, hacked down and killed in a Paris street by servants of the king's cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. And you can see the Duke of Orleans lying dead in the street here with his left hand hacked off where he tried to protect himself against the sword blows. This was a shocking murder, and it meant that France was divided now not just by political rivalries, but by a blood feud, and soon by civil war. Extraordinarily, John of Burgundy, seen here, a very magnificent man with a very fine line in black velvet hats, as you can see, but extraordinarily, he didn't even attempt to deny the killing. Instead, he argued that it had been justified because Orleans had been a tyrant and a traitor. That was an argument which, of course, got nowhere with the Duke of Orleans' young son or his allies. And by 1411, armies were in the field to fight the cause of the two factions, who were now known as Burgundians, after their leader, the Duke of Burgundy, and Armagnac, after the new young Duke of Orleans' father-in-law, the Count of Armagnac. Campaign followed truce, and truce followed campaign in this civil war. And the turns of fortune's wheel were now so violent that one observer in Paris, whose name is now sadly lost to history, but he kept a journal throughout these years, that eyewitness in Paris concluded wearily that the great all hated each other. Both sides even looked for support to England in the last years of the troubled reign of Henry IV, and Prince Hal, the future Henry V, was prepared to do business and send troops to help the Burgundians, while his father did the same with the Armagnacs. So when Hal found himself on the throne and set about launching his invasion in 1415, he knew exactly what he was getting into and what moment he was taking advantage of. This isn't simply a question of plucky England taking on the great might of France. It was the English, under the leadership of possibly the most able man ever to wear the English crown, ruthlessly seizing a moment at which it seemed France was dismembering itself before the English enemy ever set foot on French soil. Of course, once it became clear that Henry's intentions were serious, and especially once it was apparent that Harfleur might fall, the great lords of France, however much they might hate each other, did stir in their kingdom's defence. A call to arms sounded across northern France, and the poor mad king, with his teenage son, the Dauphin, by his side, was moved to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, from where the defence of the kingdom would be organised. Almost all the greatest lords of France who were capable of fighting answered this call, apart from the two greatest enemies within France's warring royal family, John of Burgundy and Charles, the new Duke of Orleans. It seems that those two were given orders to stay away, which seems a wise move on the part of the royal council to keep them apart and away from the fighting, given the danger that their own private war might spill over into the kingdom's campaign against the English. But in the end, since neither the king nor the Dauphin would in the end ride with their troops because both were too vulnerable and too precious to risk on the battlefield, the decision was taken that the Duke of Orleans should be there after all, as their nearest male relative. And even though the Duke of Burgundy wouldn't be there, his two brothers, the Duke of Brabant and the Count of Nevers, would represent him. So it was an imposing French army, probably 12,000 troops or more. I should say at this point that the numbers on each side are still the subject of fierce academic controversy, and I'm not proposing to wade into that argument now. What is clear overall is that the French had a significantly larger army and that it was composed mainly of men-at-arms. The number of men-at-arms in the smaller English army was many, many times fewer because the bulk of the English forces were made up of archers, longbowmen, of whom the French, in turn, had very few. And the French plan was to use their superior numbers overall, and particularly their superior numbers of men-at-arms, to crush the English with an irresistible charge of heavy cavalry that would take out the archers, leaving the way clear for the greater force of French men-at-arms to overwhelm their English opponents. So on the morning of the 25th of October 1415, the two sides drew themselves up on open ground between the villages of Azincourt and Tramcourt and the woodlands that surrounded the villages. Here we have a later representation of the battle, and you'll see just how wrong it is. We shouldn't envisage two blocks of longbowmen pointing at each other with equal numbers or vaguely parallel numbers of horsed men-at-arms behind. We have to envisage a huge number of men-at-arms on foot and on horse on the French side, wearing the white cross of France, and on the English side, overwhelmingly a force of archers with the few men-at-arms that Henry still had left to him gathered between and among them. Now, the English army was exhausted after their long march and suffering from the physically and psychologically debilitating effects of days of heavy rain. But we do have to remember that the conditions were much the same for the French troops, for whom the weather had been no kinder, and who'd either been shadowing the English as they tried to find a crossing of the Somme, or travelling at speed to join this hastily arranged rendezvous. It's clear that the French did have force of numbers on their side. What's less clear when we look simply at the numbers is that they had very little in the way of a plan. Or rather, they did have the plan that their cavalry should charge down the English archers, their men-at-arms should advance, and that victory should follow. But this was a plan that had been devised well in advance of their arrival at the battlefield, and it therefore took no account of the ground over which the fighting would actually take place, or the possibility that tactics might need to change in response to the disposition of the enemy's forces. Most important of all, though, was the fact that the French had no effective leadership and no chain of command. Such planning as there had been undertaken by what was in effect a committee of lords, all conscious of their status and vying for honour, rather than focusing on the specific threat that this bedraggled enemy might still represent. And that, planning by committee, was no replacement for what the English had, the vision of an experienced military leader with a cool head and implacable resolve, as well as the ability to communicate that resolve to his men. The absence of an effective chain of command within the French forces was physically embodied in their front line, where all the great lords were jostling for a position of honour, even if that meant leaving their men leaderless way behind them. And once the fighting started, this imbalance, not of numbers, but of leadership, immediately began to tell. The first wave of the French cavalry charge, which was intended to overrun the archers who'd been placed on the two flanks of the English army ahead, found that they were riding into a storm of English arrows. The best longbowmen, and English and Welsh archers were the best, could shoot almost continuously, and at close range the piercing heads of their arrows had a devastating effect, even on men wearing plate armour, not to mention the animals they rode. Those who somehow got through this dense rain of death found that they were riding onto death of a different kind, because Henry had ordered each archer to plant a 6-foot sharpened stake into the ground next to him, on which frightened horses suddenly found themselves impaled. The cavalry charge on each flank, and the advancing men-at-arms who found themselves funneled into an increasingly constricted space in between them, continued to press forward as those at the front either fell or tried to turn back, and that produced devastation of a third and horrifying kind, the piling up of bodies of horses and men in the sucking mud, so that death might come by suffocation or crushing, if not by arrow or stake. And I don't mean in any sense to be flippant when I say that we should perhaps think about our own experience of the Hillsborough disaster to get some kind of sense of what can happen when too many people are funneled into too small a space. And once those piles of helpless men and animals began to grow, the archers, the English archers who carried knives and axes at their belt, could set about any still breathing with hacking blades. There certainly was French hubris here, a certainty of their own glorious supremacy and a fatal failure to take the enemy sufficiently seriously. But what we have to recognise is that this wasn't a reflection of Shakespeare's indolent and arrogant aristocrats. It was the outcome of a context in which France had had no leadership for years. And not only no leadership, but had found itself engulfed by a vicious and brutal struggle for power that undermined any attempt at concerted or focused resistance to one of the greatest war leaders of the entire Middle Ages. And that's the context we have to understand, if we're to understand not just the battle itself, but what came next. Because Agincourt didn't lead straight on, Shakespeare style, to Henry being recognised as the heir to the French throne and the establishment of English France. The battle did have powerful consequences. First of all, in practical terms, the French dead included many nobles because they'd all been crowding into the front line. The rate of attrition among the great lords of France was extraordinarily high. Among the dead were the Dukes of Alençon and Bar, the Constable, the highest military officer in the kingdom, and the Duke of Burgundy's two brothers. Not only that, but more princes of the blood were prisoners, the Duke of Bourbon, the Count of Richemont, and most importantly, Charles of Orleans, here shown in the Tower of London as a prisoner, writing the poetry for which he later became famous. And the shape of the war with England and the civil war within France would be profoundly shaped by these losses of personnel for the next 2 decades. But it wasn't only that. Defeat at what the French called the wretched day of Azincourt had profound effects too in political, conceptual, theological terms, which we underestimate at our peril. The War of 1415, like all medieval wars, was a conflict in which God had been involved from the very beginning. The outcome of battles, contemporaries believed, was always the result of God's will. And so, from the English point of view, interpreting what had happened that fateful day was a matter of the utmost simplicity. Henry's claim to the throne of France, and also his dynasty's right to wear the crown of England, had been gloriously vindicated by his astonishing victory. The very fact that this was a rerun of David vanquishing an arrogant Goliath proved that this was heaven's mandate in action. Henry was fighting a just war, and that was made absolutely plain in the account of the campaign written by one of the royal chaplains who'd formed the spiritual core of the English army. They sat behind the English lines as the battle raged at Agincourt, praying furiously for divine intervention. And when he wrote up his account of what had happened, he said that Henry was the true elect of God, his own soldier. Another chronicler reported in all seriousness that St George himself had been spotted on the battlefield fighting on the English side. And here we have a contemporary illustration of that. That's in fact the Duke of Bedford, Henry V's younger brother, who later became regent of France, encountering St George, who you can see here is not only wearing his own red cross, but he's wrapped in the blue robes of the Order of the Garter. He's an English knight through and through. So the question that remained for Henry V's uncle, the Bishop of Winchester, addressing Parliament in 1416, was this. Given that the English had won so many notable victories, he mentioned Sluis in 1340, Poitiers in 1356, and now Agincourt in 1415, why were the French so slow to get the message? "Oh God," he said, "why does this wretched and stiff-necked nation not obey these divine sentences, so many and so terrible, to which, by a vengeance most clearly made manifest, obedience is demanded of them?" But for the French, explaining their defeat was more difficult. It couldn't possibly be that the English were actually right. That much they knew. Instead, God must be using the English to punish the French temporarily for their sins. But if sin was the heart of the matter, then whose sin was most at fault? And that question was unanswerable in the context of the brutal divisions within France, as each side pointed an accusing finger at the other. The net effect, therefore, of their defeat on the field of blood at Azincourt was to redouble the violence of the civil war. Henry, meanwhile, was a long way from achieving his objectives. He had his Bridgehead at Harfleur and he had God on his side, but it was the intensifying conflict between Burgundians and Armagnacs that gave him time to plan a new campaign. And then in 1417, when his new fleet was ready to sail, it gave him the perfect opportunity to advance across Normandy while France's domestic enemies fought for control of their own capital. And our Parisian observer was already coming round to the view that this English assault was no longer the worst of the horrors France had to face. Some people, he wrote, who had come to Paris from Normandy, having escaped from the English by paying ransom or some other way, had then been captured by the Burgundians, and then a mile or so further on had been captured yet again by the Armagnacs, and had been as brutally and as cruelly treated by them as if by Saracens. These men, all honest merchants, reputable men, who had been in the hands of all three and had bought their freedom, solemnly affirmed on oath that the English had been kinder to them than the Burgundians had, and the Burgundians 100 times kinder than the Armagnacs. Meanwhile, with characteristically inexorable purpose, Henry was moving step by step across Normandy. First, he took the great castle and town of Caen, and with it Bayeux, then Alençon, Argentan, and Falaise. And then in January 1419, after a 5-month siege, he finally starved Rouen, the capital of Normandy, into submission. 2 weeks after that, his forces were only 30 miles from Paris, and again our anonymous observer had some pithy points to make. No one, he said, did anything about it, because all the French lords were angry with each other, because the Dauphin was at odds with his father on account of the Duke of Burgundy, who was with the king, and all the other princes of the blood royal had been taken prisoner by the English king at the Battle of Azincourt. But the key to Henry's triumph wasn't that battle, and it wasn't even his formidable advance into the heart of northern France during 1418 and the early months of 1419. The key to Henry's success in getting his hands on the crown of France, or at least much more nearly than any of his predecessors or his successors, was an event that took place on the 10th of September, 1419. The desperate search for a settlement between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs had produced frantic diplomacy in the summer months. Envoys had met in all possible combinations. English and Armagnac, Armagnac and Burgundian, Burgundian and English. But the one that really mattered was the meeting convened in September between the Duke of Burgundy himself and the Armagnac Dauphin. This wasn't the same Dauphin as at Agincourt. Charles VI's sons had an unfortunate habit of dying young. This was his youngest son, Charles, the new Dauphin. And the Duke of Burgundy and the young Dauphin, still in his teens, met at Montereau, where the river Yonne gave into the Seine. And like many diplomatic meetings, this one was arranged for security reasons in the middle of a bridge. Both sides agreed to meet with no more than 10 men each, and the meeting place meant that neither could be ambushed by some hidden army. So that afternoon, the Dauphin and the Duke gathered as arranged. Within a specially constructed wooden enclosure in the middle of the bridge, the Duke knelt at the Dauphin's feet. And then the man standing next to the Dauphin, a former servant of the Duke of Orleans named Tanguy du Châtel, buried an axe deep in the Duke's skull. It was a murder more precisely planned and more ruthlessly executed than the Duke of Burgundy's murder of the Duke of Orleans himself in the streets of Paris 12 years earlier. And it was a murder that irretrievably altered the essence of the conflict, because now there could be no hope whatsoever that reconciliation could be brokered between Armagnac and Burgundian. And the direct result of that was a treaty sealed at Troyes in May 1420, by which Henry V's ambitions finally came to fruition. There, in the cathedral, Henry bound himself to marry the French Princess Catherine, the daughter of the Mad King Charles VI. And in return, the Mad King himself, speaking of course through the person of his loyal subject, the Duke of Burgundy, the son of the Duke whose skull had been stoved in at Montereau, the Mad King disinherited the Dauphin who'd been responsible for that terrible crime, and recognised instead that Henry V should be the heir to France after the king's death and regent of the kingdom until that time. That's the true story that the gorgeous drama of Shakespeare's Henry V leaves out. The creation of English France not through his victory at Agincourt, astonishing though it was, but through the bitter and bloody civil war in France, in which the dreadful defeat of Azincourt played a significant part. So that by 1420, the hatred between the two sides within France was so intense that large parts of the kingdom, including the capital Paris, would rather see the English king on the French throne than the so-called Dauphin. And that was a story that would play itself out over the next 30 years, the battle between English France in the north and the Kingdom of Bourges in the south, as Armagnac France came to be called. And this wasn't a story with an inevitable ending. So we need to remember, in telling the story of Agincourt, that France could have ended up taking on a very different shape, geographically or politically. Though what did eventually transpire takes us back to our beginning, our greatest hits, and the extraordinary intervention of another charismatic military leader, every bit as certain as Henry V that God was on her side, the victories rather than the execution of Joan of Arc. So I have one last thought to leave you with. England had its own civil war later in the 15th century, a civil war that we know as the Wars of the Roses. It began in earnest once all of Henry's gains in France were finally lost in 1450. And it came about because the son born to Henry and the French Princess Catherine didn't take after his father. Instead, he grew to be a king who was vague and indecisive, and as the years went on, increasingly mentally absent. No decision he made couldn't be overturned by the next person to whisper in his ear. In other words, he didn't take after his father. He took after his maternal grandfather, the Mad King Charles VI of France. So if we want to understand the whole sweep of the 15th century history of England and France, the huge and dramatic story that goes far beyond the glittering jewel of Shakespeare's Henry V, there are many reasons not to begin and end our tale with the Battle of Agincourt. Thank you very much for listening.